Edmund Kemper was 14 years old when he was sent to stay with his paternal grandparents at their remote farmhouse in the Sierra Mountains of California. He found the life there dull, even though his grandfather gave him a .22 rifle to go out shooting, and his grandmother seemed to spend all day working on the children's storybooks that she wrote. On August 27, 1963, young Ed wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma, and he did just that. When his grandfather returned from shopping at the local town store, he shot him too. In due course, Ed was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and committed to the state hospital for the criminally insane at Atascadero. Kemper lived with his grandparents because his home life was in disarray. His father and mother were divorced after years of a tempestuous relationship. Both had remarried, and he did not get on with either of his step-parents. Born in Burbank, California in December 1948, he had spent his early years dominated by his mother, whose standards of behavior he found impossible to meet. This made him timid in nature, with feelings of inadequacy, coupled with a deep-down resentment of his treatment. With his two sisters, young Ed would often play out a game of execution in which he was the victim. On one occasion, he cut the head and hands off one of his sister's dolls. By the age of 10, he had buried the family cat alive, only to later cut off its head and display it in his bedroom. Another cat was dismembered with a machete and the pieces hidden in a closet until they were discovered by his mother. At the same time, he enjoyed fantasies of sex and violence. When one sister teased him about his crush on his grade school teacher and asked why he didn't give her a kiss, he calmly replied, "If I kiss her, I would have to kill her first." Even his mother described Ed as a real weirdo and eventually sent him to live with his father, from where he was soon moved to his grandparents and the subsequent murders. After spending 5 years in Atascadero, the 21-year-old was released in 1969 against his doctor's advice into the custody of his mother, who had relocated to Santa Cruz and was working at local Merrill College as an administrator. He had grown into a giant 6 feet 9 inches in height and weighing some 300 pounds. After incessant arguments with his mother, he moved to Alameda, near San Francisco. He then bought a car and cruised the highways, at first just giving rides to young female hitchhikers while learning conversational ways to put them at ease. Then, on May 7, 1972, Kemper picked up two 18-year-old co-eds, Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesi, not far from Stanford University. He drove them to an isolated spot and drew a 9mm Browning automatic that he had borrowed from a friend. He then took out a pair of handcuffs and secured Mary Ann's wrists behind her and locked Anita in the trunk at gunpoint. Producing a plastic bag, Kemper thrust it over Mary Ann's head and wound a cord around her neck. As she fought for her life, he stabbed her many times and finally cut her throat. Opening the trunk, he stabbed Anita to death as she tried to climb out, threw the knife inside with her body, and drove home. The friend with whom Kemper shared an apartment in Alameda was away, so he carried the bodies wrapped in blankets to his room, where he dismembered them, taking Polaroid photographs as he worked. He stuffed the remains in garbage bags and drove off to bury them in the mountains, but he kept the heads for some time before finally tossing them into a lonely ravine. Mary Ann's head was discovered some months later and identified from dental records, but the police were without a fake police office, further clues. For some months, Kemper did not. Although he had been rejected by the police, Kemper picked up much of their professional approach and go out looking for likely hitch. Was able to follow the progress of the investigation of hikers and turned his attention, his crimes from the conversations he had with them with his mother's backing, to the jury room. Somehow he managed to obtain getting the murder of his police training school badge and handcuffs from a grandparents expunged from his officer he had befriended, and with his car, which was record. However, the day before, similar in appearance to a patrol cruiser and fitted with, he was due for a final hearing on a CB radio and a whip aerial. He was able to fantasize. September 15th, 1972, he offered that he was a police officer and also set the minds of Lift to Petite Ikoku, a 15-year, the hitchhikers he picked up at ease. Old dance student, he drove her out into the mountains, overpowered her a simple matter with his size and strength, raped her and strangled her to death. Once more, after dismembering her body and dumping the remains in an isolated area, he kept her head in the trunk of his car. It was still there the next day when court psychiatrists in Fresno were so impressed with Kemper's rehabilitation that they recommended the sealing of his juvenile record. Running short of money and unable to keep up the rent on his Alameda apartment, Kemper returned to his mother's home in Aptos, outside Santa Cruz, but she remained as critical and domineering as ever. He spent some of his time in a saloon, the jury room, chatting with off-duty policemen. Indeed, he had hoped to join the police force but had been turned down because he was too big. The sealing of Kemper's record was confirmed in November, and now, with an apparently clean slate, he was able to buy himself a gun on January 8th, 1973. The following day, he picked up trainee teacher Cindy Schall in Santa Cruz, drove out into the hills, and shot her to death. He carried the body back to his mother's home in the car trunk, sexually assaulted it, then dissected it in the bathtub. Leaving Cindy's severed head in a box in his closet, he took her remains in garbage sacks to his car and threw them over a cliff into the sea south of Monterey. When he heard that a highway patrolman had spotted the sacks shortly afterwards, Kemper buried the head in his mother's backyard. With a macabre turn of humor, he placed it facing his mother's bedroom window. She had always wanted people to look up to her. 4 weeks later, on February 5th, after yet another fierce argument with his mother, who wanted him to enroll in college and get a degree, Kemper stormed out of the house and drove into Santa Cruz. On the campus of the college where his mother worked, he picked up 23-year-old student Rosalind Thorpe. It was a wet night, and as he drove away with her, he saw another student, Alice Liu, 21, waving for a lift. He stopped for her. Then, on the road down to Santa Cruz, he turned to Rosalind, who was sitting beside him, and shot her. Then he shot Alice, who was in the back seat. On a quiet road out of town, he transferred both bodies to the trunk and drove home. As his mother was in the house, he opened the trunk and decapitated both girls with a hunting knife right there on the open street. The next day, after sexually assaulting Alice's corpse in his bedroom, Kemper took both bodies this time. He didn't keep either head and drove north to the Bay Area, where he dumped them in a canyon and then threw the girls' heads and hands over a cliff. 2 weeks later, the bodies were found and identified, and the police linked the murders with that of Cindy Schall and a fellow student who was not, in fact, one of Kemper's victims. The hunt was on for the co-ed killer. Kemper realized that his time was running out and decided on one last bloody act as a demonstration to the authorities, as he later described it. At dawn on April 5th, he crept into his mother's bedroom and killed her with a hammer, crushing her skull and then cutting off her head. Finally, he cut out her larynx and fed it into the waste disposal, as he later confessed. It seemed appropriate as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over so many years. There was no going back now. Kemper called a friend of his mother, Sally Hallett, and invited her over for a surprise dinner. When Mrs. Hallett arrived, she said, "Let's sit down, I'm dead." And he took her at her word and strangled her. He then left for a drink at the jury room. On his return, he cut off the woman's head and left her body in bed. At dawn next morning, Easter Sunday, without an idea of what to do, Kemper set off driving aimlessly eastward for many hours, having left a note for the police beside his mother's corpse. No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of this murderous butcher. It was quick asleep the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I got things to do. Keeping himself awake with caffeine tablets, Kemper at last arrived in Pueblo, Colorado, where he pulled over to a roadside telephone booth and called the Santa Cruz police to confess that he was the co-ed killer. At first, they did not believe him, and it took several more calls before the local police arrived to arrest him. At his trial, Kemper outlined his motive in killing young women. Alive, they were distant, not sharing with me. I was trying to establish a relationship. When they were being killed, there wasn't anything going on in my mind, except that they were going to be mine. That was the only way they could be mine. I had their spirits. I still have them. Judged sane by state psychiatrists, Kemper was convicted on 8 counts of murder. Asked what he considered suitable punishment, he replied starkly, "Death by torture." However, there was no death penalty at that time in California, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment.